This is the problem with vehicles in Warhammer 40,000. In a previous video, I spotlighted some problems with the Predator tank, which essentially boiled down to it being less offensively potent, and being less versatile, while also not being functionally tougher, while also being too expensive considering all these lacks. This video is a successor to that one, as there is a fundamental problem with vehicles and monsters of all types, but one that is especially noteworthy on tanks. For clarity, the primary issue I am speaking to is that vehicles and monsters are too fragile. That specifically, they are too fragile compared to various infantry options. Infantry options, which often have better abilities built in, which can innately take better advantage of terrain, which often have better rules synergy, and which have inherent advantages with regards to controlling objectives. For Pete's sake, a Chaos Predator Annihilator is 130 points. For 10 points more, you can have a unit of Possessed, a unit which is vastly superior with regards to the criteria specified. The claim that tanks are too fragile, which to be honest extends to all tough vehicles and monsters, along with the example I've illustrated, is one I'm sure most players feel. And now with the remainder of this video, let's go over why that is the case. The first component of the vehicle-monster fragility problem is the issue of being too soft. The roots of the vehicle and monster durability problem can all be traced back to how GW structured the attack sequence back in 8th edition. You see, coming off the heels of 7th, GW wanted a simpler system. A system where anything could wound anything. And in their goal to allow any model to have a functional chance to wound any target, they overcompensated, and lowered the toughness floor for vehicles far too severely. Our current paradigm is essentially light vehicles are toughness 6, standard vehicles are toughness 7, tough vehicles are toughness 8, with only the very toughest vehicles and monsters being toughness 9. I've color-coded the chart for wound thresholds, using reds for poor, yellow for the medium 4+, and greens for 3+ or better because green is best. This standard allows infantry-based anti-armor weapons to wound most vehicles at a desirable threshold of 3+. Keep in mind, this is before factoring any abilities to further bolster that performance rating. We can contrast this with a selection of big boy heavy cannons on vehicle units, that while are better, are only slightly so. Compare this with how wounding vehicles worked in 7th, where a weapon had to roll a d6, adding the result to its strength, so that the result is at least equal to the target's armor value to deal damage. That paradigm is essentially, light vehicles are armor 10, standard are pretty much armor 12, with tough vehicles being armor 14. This results in those same infantry-based anti-armor weapons having a much harder time wounding those higher toughness vehicles. Though note, they still remain effective against lighter vehicles, and similarly effective versus standard vehicles. It also sees the big boy heavy cannons on vehicle and monster units performing more efficiently, though admittedly less effective than I would prefer. It's worth noting that the streamlining of how wounding vehicles worked in 8th edition did come with benefits. I for one do like that the same attack sequence is used regardless of whether or not the target is a vehicle, but you can see that the toughest vehicles lost too much of their resilience versus infantry-based anti-armor weapons. Just compare and contrast. In 7th, the multi-melta needed to roll a 6 to wound the mighty monolith, whereas now it does so on a 4+. And yes, in 8th and 9th, that multi-melta's damage still needs to pass a saving throw, but the odds are slim since it's AP 4 versus armor save 2, just as slim as it would be to wound in 7th. This brings me to the position I wish to share, which is, vehicle and monster grade anti-armor weapons are what ought to wound durable vehicles and monsters with ease. This paradigm would result in players being unable to rely on infantry so broadly to deal with enemy armor. Sure, there ought to be some exceptions, but it should be few. Salamander's Eradicators, Fire Dragons with Fugin, and Dark Eldar Haywire weapons are a few that come to mind. Which leads into part B of the vehicle monster fragility problem, which is damage susceptibility. This issue is a little less clear-cut, as it's essentially an amalgam of issues, so we're gonna have to walk our way through it, starting with binary damage. What I mean by binary damage is simply that, as an attack goes through the attack sequence, it must pass a hit test, a wound test, and finally a save test. The outcome of that save test will determine if the damage is dealt or not. You either take an attack's damage or you don't. It's binary. Unless that unit has a feel no pain, which is not always an accessible option, and is one that is also unideal for the purpose due to its inconsistency. And so, because damage is binary, and damage does not carry over to multiple models in a unit, it carries a disproportionate severity for single model units with large wound pools, i.e. vehicles and monsters. A Gladiator Lancer's laser destroyer can do severe damage to a Gladiator Lancer with a damage potential of 8 to 12 across 2 attacks. However, that weapon into a squad of Battle Sisters at best kills 2 models, due to the breakpoints caused from having multiple models in the unit. The lack of breakpoints on vehicles and monsters makes them extremely vulnerable to devastating single-shot weapons, and so the ability to deny value of those weapons through taking infantry becomes preferable. Hence my example from earlier. So considering that damage is binary, and that vehicles and monsters don't have the luxury of breakpoints, which limits the amount of damage they can sustain from high damage weapons, we can see that vehicles and monsters are too vulnerable to damage. Speaking to what I mentioned earlier, the issue isn't as linear, as there are 2 immediate approaches to resolve the problem. Either, the damage of infantry-grade anti-armor weapons should be reduced when going into tough targets, such that it is reflective of the durability of those units. Or, the damage of infantry-grade anti-armor weapons should be reduced relative to their dedicated alternatives. And interestingly enough, GW is sort of doing both of these approaches, at least partially. Well, at least the seeds of them have appeared. Dreadnoughts and their faction equivalents already reduce damage, though it's all damage, and not yet modulated by the attack versus the target. And we can also look to the Venom Cannon. To me, this is the golden compass which points to the ideal paradigm. We have an infantry-grade anti-armor weapon, which is threatening to light vehicles, which tapers off in effectiveness versus tough vehicles, but is still capable of leveling an elite infantry model, while its heavy variant, only accessible on monster units, has an easier time wounding the tough tier targets. Regardless, if GW wants a Predator Annihilator shooting at a Predator Annihilator to take an average of 4 last cannon shots that have successfully hit, wounded, and passed the saving throw to result in its destruction, then it stands to reason the infantry version of a last cannon should take a few more, along with having a harder time to get that damage to pass through. Well, that's it for this one. I hope you enjoyed this brief dissection on the problem with tough vehicles and monsters. Thanks for watching, and a special thanks to my patrons, Julius Maximus, as well as the others who help keep the dream alive. So what do you think on the state of vehicles and monsters? Do you disagree with my position, and prefer for infantry to be capable of turning tanks to slag with ease? Let me know in the comments. Anyways, there are buttons for liking, sharing, and subscribing, so press the buttons you want to press, and I'll catch you in the next one.